Namaste, everyone. On behalf of JKYog, I have the distinct honor and pleasure to welcome all of you to the 111th anniversary of International Women's Day. JKYog has a wonderful 4-day program culminating in a grand award ceremony on March 8th. As you know, JKYog honors the spirit of exemplary women from across the world. These are the women who have shown the grit, commitment, and passion to excel in their respective fields. JKYog has a conference each year to celebrate the accomplishments of exemplary women. This year's conference on forging gender equity in the 21st century is very exciting for all of us because it gives us the opportunity to ponder about what gender equity actually means and how we can remember to inculcate those values and principles in all aspects of our daily lives. So the conference theme for this year is Break the Bias. On this very special occasion, JKYog will honor a special category of women honorees for scripting their success stories of excellence amidst insurmountable challenges. So let's move on with the program of the day. Today I have the incredible honor of introducing you to Professor Rohini Godbole, our distinguished speaker for International Women's Day Conference. Namaste. Professor Godbole is currently an honorary professor at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. She is a theoretical particle physicist who has been affiliated with numerous prestigious institutions both in India and abroad. Her research over the past 4 decades has resulted in over 300 publications in refereed journals and archived preprints, as well as graduate-level textbooks. Her pioneering work on probing hadronic interactions of photons provided important insights for the design of electron-positron colliders, and her suggestions to probe standard model and beyond standard model physics has been used in experiments at different colliders. A fellow of the World Academy of Science, she has been elected to the 3 Science Academies of India. She has served as Vice President of the Indian National Academy of Sciences, Allahabad, and is currently serving as the Vice President of Indian Academy of Sciences. She is and has been a member of different national and international advisory bodies and the chief editor of Praman, Journal of Physics of Indian Academy of Sciences. She is also a member of various editorial boards of national and international journals. But beyond her exemplary academic credentials, Professor Godbole has been an avid supporter of the cause of women in science, working over the past decades to facilitate more effective participation of women in the scientific workforce. Among her lasting contributions is the co-edited book, Leelavati's Daughters, The Women Scientists of India, which comprises of autobiographical sketches of Indian women scientists as well as landmark surveys on the status of women in science. Professor Godbole chaired the Committee on Equity and Inclusion for India's Science, Technology and Innovation Policy of 2020. She was bestowed the Padma Shri Award in 2019, the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Karnataka Academy of Science in 2021, and has received several other international honors and awards. If I start describing everything on her vita, we would not have any time for her talk. So I encourage people to go to the International Women's Day Conference website at the Radhakrishna Temple .net or JKYog.org, and please familiarize yourself with all of her exemplary work. So Professor Godbole, thank you so much for agreeing to be with us here today and honoring us with taking time from your busy schedule to talk to us about all the wonderful things that have inspired other people when they read your work and listen to you. So please go ahead. Welcome to our program.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Let me begin by sharing my slides. But I think 1 second, it's going to take a minute. Yeah. Can you see my screen? I hope you can see my screen now. So let me, since this would be a conference on the International Women's Day, let me begin first by wishing everybody a happy Women's Day. And let me also begin by congratulating the JKYog for hosting this conference, fostering gender equality in the 21st century. I think that's really a very welcome step. And from what I can understand, JKYog has been doing it for years. So this is indeed very praiseworthy. So let me just begin by saying what is it that I'm going to talk about. And since the theme of this year's International Women's Day is gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow, break the bias, I thought I would talk about biases in general, not just the gender bias. So my discussion is going to be about equity and inclusion in science, and what roles can individuals, institutions, and society play to bring this about. So I would like to first discuss why equity and inclusion are important in science. And then, of course, I want to focus on issues which are specific to gender. We will argue in the course of this discussion of half an hour that both policy changes and the changes in the mindset are necessary. And then I would try to tell you how considerations of equity and inclusion in India's science, technology, and innovation policy will help India in achieving this. And then I would like to I hope I'll be left with some time, which I would want to present a few ideas how we can have contributions from individuals, institutions, and society to achieve equity and inclusion. So to begin with, let me just say that, of course, when we talk of equity and inclusion in science, one of the motivations for demanding or wanting to have equity and inclusion in science is to correct the historical injustices and the exclusion of all the different groups from processes of science. But it is equally important to realize that inclusion and diversity can only add in increasing the efficacy of the scientific processes by adding more dimensions to the scientific ecosystem. And the more, are the dimensions of the ecosystem, it can actually lead to further excellence in S&T. So this is really the need for equity and inclusion in science for science. Okay. Now, the diversity in scientific processes, okay, I have been using different words. I'm using equity and inclusion, diversity, and so on and so forth. So let's just try to get this a bit defined. Diversity in scientific processes means participation of different diverse groups. It can be diversity of gender, which is, of course, a subject close to my heart, but diversity of language, diversity of social economic class, diversity of geographical region, physical abilities, knowledge systems, so on and so forth. And some of the groups, in each case, either gender or people from less endowed, economically less endowed class, some of the groups are underrepresented. And reasons are quite often historical. Now, what does achieving diversity mean? Achieving diversity means inclusion for those groups which are excluded for historical reasons. And an example that I want to give later is traditional knowledge systems. And secondly, equity for those underrepresented groups where some inclusion already exists. An example I would give is gender. Now, what do I mean by equity? What do I mean by equity is that I don't mean equality as much as equity, is that I should have equitable representation of the trained community science in the processes of science. And when we can make it equal in case of gender, all the better. So this is what one means, this is sort of the relationship between equity and inclusion and diversity. Now, one can naturally ask this question that yes, one can understand the importance of diversity in social processes, but why discuss diversity and science and technology together? What are the implications that diversity can have for science and technology? Why should lack of diversity be an issue at all for science and technology? How does it influence course of science? I just kind of grandly made one statement that it makes the system multidimensional. Now I want to try and answer that question a little more precisely. So another way of asking the same question as the earlier two questions is that does diversity necessarily add to excellence? And actually, I will provide an answer by quoting from an open letter to the Supreme Court Justice of the US that's written by professional physicists in 2015. It was signed by about 2,000 physicists in the US. And this was actually in answer to a question that was asked by the Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, Roberts, at that time. What was the question? The question asked by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was, what unique perspective does a minority student bring to a physics class? And one answer that was provided by this group of physicists, and it equally applies to all the other sciences. Indeed, science relies heavily on consensus about acceptable results as well as future research directions, making diversity among scientists a crucial aspect of objective, bias-free science. So this is the first reason. And the second, to my mind, even equally important, is that the diverse groups bring their background, ways of thinking, methods of applying physics to real-world problems, and most importantly, the potential to educate others through their unique perspective. So this kind of tells you why diversity is important for science. Historically and socially, there exists a lot of biases, some myths, and some comments are made. And there is always a question asked, Are all people equal when it comes to all sciences? And in fact, a long time back, Harvard president Larry Summers, I think the poor fellow never really lived it down. He actually had concluded that women lack capability in mathematical and physical sciences. Of course, this was not proved to be not correct. And in India, for example, we don't have our Larry Summers. But we are still not inundated with women practicing science. So just like in the US, India, the world over, the world of science is not dominated by women practicing science. So in fact, in trying to answer this question that was asked by Supreme Court Justice Roberts, in fact, two scientists did an investigation and they published it, and this is the URL of that publication, where they actually showed by a study that diverse groups are less conformist and therefore they are more willing to go against the status quo if that leads to better outcomes. And as we all know, in fact, thinking out of the box is one of the requirements of innovation. So any kind of diversity, whether it is gender diversity or racial diversity, it can affect the actions of the group in a positive way for increasing efficacy of science. So having said this, let me also state a fact of life that diversity among practitioners of science is very small across the world, across all sciences. Now, is that necessarily bad? I think everybody knows that the answer is yes, it is necessarily bad. And why is that so? Because it is certainly not the optimal use of humanity's intellectual potential. It's like keeping a lot of your money, lot of your capital locked up in your safe. So as many different inputs come, any creative activity grows further. So diversity can only be good for science as for any creative activity. And I think the earlier discussion, investigations by Sandroni that I told you, actually tried to prove it in the context of social science. Now, there are three kinds of diversity that I will touch upon. One is a diversity of knowledge systems. Now, use of traditional knowledge systems, I believe, can lead us to interesting innovations, which can make important contributions to the sustainable development goals. And right now, India is rather low on this list. I will try to give some examples. But indeed, if you want science for sustainable development, diversity of knowledge system is important. Then I would discuss a second issue, namely racial diversity. And I would try to show you how achieving racial diversity made very important positive difference in the USA of 1960s. Now, the third aspect that I will cover is gender diversity. I want to start with the story of invention of calendar that was told by Sonia Toksvig. She is an anthropologist working in, who studied in Cambridge or Oxford, I forget which one. And in her anthropology class, her teacher taught her, and she said that the first calendar was a bone with 28 incisions. Now, when you think a little bit, reflect a little bit, you realize that this must have been invented by a woman, because what man needs to keep track of 28 days? But till it is pointed out explicitly, one always attributes this invention as to man or mankind. Now, many people say that that's just words, it's just semantics, it's just a manner of speaking, but actually not. Usage of these words actually can affect attitudes toward women in science. And I'm going to try and give you examples. But before I give you examples, let me also accept one fact and state it very clearly. It is silly to say that lack of equity has impeded development of excellent science, which has been mainly led since the time of Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, by white Caucasian males. But the question that we want to answer or ask and answer both is that can we point out examples where the lack of opportunities, let's say for gender, for women, clearly cause science to lose something. In other words, achieving gender equity or equality, as the title of the conference says, can avoid such losses. And here I will give you an example of a mathematician called Sophie Germain. And then I also want to give you a second example where gaining diversity, actually, that is gender and racial diversity in the workforce, actually was responsible for a gain. And here I will tell you a story about something called hidden figures. So Sophie Germain, she was born in 1776 and lived a rather short life till 1831. As you can see, she was born in the period of French Revolution. Her father was a marquis or somebody of that sort. And during the revolution days, he moved out of the city and saved himself and the family on his estate. And this girl in those years read the books that her father had and taught herself mathematics and realized that she wants to study mathematics. But it was not considered proper for a middle-class girl to study mathematics and science. So family even took away her candles and finally relented. Now, this is what I mean by saying that when you say that only men do science, mankind does science, this affects these kinds of attitudes. And this led to a lack of formal training. École Polytechnique, one of the most venerable institution of France, actually was founded soon after the French Revolution when she was young, but women were not allowed there. So she used a pen name and used her cousins or friends' notes and studied and communicated with the great mathematicians of the period, such as Lagrange and Gauss. And then she ended up actually doing some very important work on theory of elasticity. She was the first woman to win a prize from French Academy for solving a problem. And she did invent something called German numbers, which actually was very, very difficult and complex. Now, what happened was that her work was rejected or was asked to be revised by experts many, many times because it lacked rigor. And it lacked rigor because she didn't have the formal training. Who knows, this Fermat's last theorem was a theorem which had actually stood unsolved for about 300 years since that time. And it was solved only in this last decade. Who knows, if Sophie had been trained, Fermat's last theorem might have been solved 300 years before. We don't know that. The other story is about the hidden figures behind the US space program. There is Dorothy Vaughan, there is Katherine Johnson, and there is Mary Jackson. Mary Jackson was the first woman of color who became engineer. Then Dorothy Vaughan was actually in charge of the computing center of what was called NACA, which was an earlier avatar of NASA. And Katherine Johnson, indeed, actually was a mathematics teacher. And all these women were scouted by the people who were trying to staff NASA at that time, or as I said, the earlier version of NASA. And they wanted to make progress in space research. But the men were all involved with the army, and therefore they went down to this deep south. And these women of color of the deep south, who were well trained in mathematics, actually led the program at that time. And Katherine Johnson, in fact, plotted the orbit of the first astronaut in space that US put when his vehicle had to re-enter the atmosphere. She was the one who plotted that orbit. She actually got the Congressional Medal of Honor after President Obama became the president of United States of America. Now, this is the story where you see a positive impact that the gender and racial diversity had. Then there is a story of traditional knowledge systems and innovation. I'm giving you an example from a talk on a thing called Shodha Yatra, by Professor Anil Gupta of Honeybee Network, and gyan.org is his website. And here they actually go around the country and travel, and they find out the methods that are used, indigenous methods, which can be replicated. And here, these are very wonderful traditional methods of harnessing waste heat to dry the husks, or harnessing the waste heat to dry damp wood in Meghalaya. And these have led to certain innovations which can certainly be contribute to sustainable development. Another example of traditional knowledge system and innovation is the application of Ayurveda during the time of coronavirus. And I am here actually showing you photographs of papers which have been published in a journal of Ayurveda and integrative medicine. It's of course important to validate traditional knowledge systems and innovate using those which are validated. And this is one of the examples of such, how diversity can add to the knowledge pool today. Another last example that I want to give you about gender diversity and knowledge gain. This is a very, very recent example. This is a paper that was published in a journal called Animal Behavior in 2020. And in this journal, in this paper, actually what these authors showed is that women are making greater contribution to the emerging field of female birdsong. What is that? The idea is, we always thought that the birds sing the courtship songs. But now over the last few decades, people have realized that female birds also sing courtship songs. And this study has been dominated by women themselves. So this kind of tells you the importance of diversity, that sometimes the diverse workforce will address previously understudied areas of science. And why would that happen? Because who we are affects what science we do. Of course, science is objective and universal. So I can hear some people who are listening to me saying, what are you talking about? Newton's law would have been the same if anybody else had invented it. It would be force is equal to mass into acceleration. So why is then its diversity important? Why is it important? Who discovers it? Now, the point is that the issues in science, one chooses to investigate, processes that are put in place, can actually be influenced by cultural or racial or gender background. In India, there is a very good example of Shalini Arya of Institute of Chemical Technology in Mumbai, India. And her work on how to make nutritious, long-lasting chapatis is actually she developed some special chemical work on grains, because this is an extremely good example, because she came from a part of the society where this was a very important ingredient of their lifestyle. Who we are affected, again, how we do science and what particular science we do really gets impacted by who we are. And I can give you only two examples. One is the first woman doctor from India to get her degree in the US. Her name was Anandibai Joshi. And she did her thesis on gynecological problems of women because she herself had lost a child at its birth when she was 14. Another interesting news item, and this is an example from the US. There is a she is still, I think, in MIT, media scientist called Joy Bulmamini. And she found that the facial recognition programs are accurate only if you are white. And they were as likely as 35% wrong if you were an African American woman. In these days of artificial intelligence, which is being used extensively in scientific research, I don't think I can overemphasize the importance of diversity. So what have I tried to tell you? That diversity is intrinsically good for science. It makes pragmatic and economic sense. The science and technology ecosystem is the beneficiary. Diversity increases the dimensionality and the complexity of the STI ecosystem even more. So, achieving equity and inclusion is not to be done only with a sense of correcting a historical wrong, It is not to be looked upon as charity to the underrepresented group, in my particular case of interest, the gender, so that their creative abilities get expression. And this is something all of us need to remember when we think of the subject. Whether it is gender equity or racial equity, I think this affects our response to the issues. So we have said diversity is important, diversity adds to science, diversity does not exist. So now how do you know what to do to achieve diversity, and how do you measure? So how do you know when diversity has been achieved? So it is easy to see lack of diversity and equity in science. And the question really to ask is, how do we cure things? How do we judge what level of diversity and equity is correct? Is there such a thing as correct level? Lack of numerical representation is a symptom, and achieving numerical targets does not mean that the problems are solved. Achieving numerical targets is necessary, but not sufficient. One has to get at the roots of the issue, and solutions have to address the reasons. This is how I see the problem. So my own view, and I think before I continue in more detail, let me take a short pause and say that my own view is that one of the important steps in this process of achieving diversity and achieving equity is becoming aware of things that are not obvious. And I will here talk about now the situation with respect to gender parity, and then I will talk about what are the challenges which are specific to women in science compared to all professional women. So this is a very schematic representation of women in science. This is the Indian story of the big fall. Real data are available. I can discuss them with people. Compared to the other world, many other parts of the world, in India, actually there is no shortage of women studying STEM subjects at the undergraduate level, at the master's level, at the PhD level. But there is a big gap when they go from PhD to postdoc. There is even bigger drop when they go to professor or senior faculty level. As you can see, there are about 35 to 40% fraction by fraction in PhDs in STEM subject, women are there. But in the young faculty, women are there maybe 15 to 20% at the most. UNESCO study also says the same. When you go to professor or senior faculty at renowned institutes, this goes down to maybe 7%. And then when you think of leaders and high achievers, it goes down to 3 to 4%. So the Indian problem is not only the development of human resource, but also human resource deployment, particularly for women. So apart from losing all the advantages that I just now explained to you that a diverse workforce can bring to science, I find that this is pragmatically a problem of low return on investments, because we spend money on training these women in science and then they're gone, poof. So a country which is committed on the path of innovation-based progress, on any community for that matter, cannot afford this brain drain. So this loss of trained scientific human resource has to be plugged. But before we plug it, we must find out what are the reasons for the drain. So there are some obvious and visible causes for the drain. One which is very specific to science is actually what I call the problem of the ticking clocks. Because when in science, getting a degree is not an end in itself. After getting your PhD, you still need to do an apprenticeship. You still need to spend a time when you carve your own niche. And that is the period of what we call postdoctoral fellowships, early career. And in this early career scientists, this is also the time when the body clocks are ticking. So the clocks of science and the body clocks are ticking simultaneously, and the beginnings are very tender and essential. Okay, and those are the difficult times for women scientists. The second set of problems, which are obvious, are common in all the other spheres as well. And that's the famous family and career balance. And by and large, people think that take care of these two problems and perhaps we are home. That is the perception. And in India, actually, I'm happy to say that there are a lot of policies which exist for women to come back to a career after a break. There exist policies for flexi time. There exists, special policies to encourage young girls to choose science and technology. There are training programs for women scientists to teach them leadership skills. all this is happening. But the reality is that all this is necessary, but not sufficient. And actually, I would like to say that even women themselves need to realize that, this is not the only thing we need to have so that we can have equity and equality, gender equity in science. And that comes from what I call invisible and unconscious bias, which comes from attitudes. Biases about what women can do and cannot do. Biases about what women should do and should not do. And it impacts the mentoring we give to young women. It impacts the decisions young women and men take. And by the way, this is not only common to the Eastern culture or whatever. This is common to the entire scientific world, East or West. And this actually can directly impact both the number of women that stay in SNT and also what they can achieve. And I believe in one line, I would say that all of it arises from the lack of importance that is attached to women's participation in science in the eyes of society and the scientists. So that is where the kind of discourses we are having are very, very important to make people realize that this is not appropriate. Actually, we found this in our survey. So sometimes the invisible bias feeds into something which is very visible. Now, this is an example where we found in our survey, which was this loss of trained scientific woman power. And we found a lesson that the biases, the unconscious biases, were also the reason for the loss, not only the family responsibility or the career and family balance. And this bias is induced unknowingly. It starts very early. For example, there is a book called Joy of Making Indian Toys. And I will tell you a story of a young girl. Her parents, she was the only daughter, the only child. They did not have any bias in upbringing her. And they gave her this book. She made only a few of the toys. And when she was asked, why did you not make the remaining toys? She said, but I made only those where girls were shown making them. So actually, I think the author Sudarshan Khanna actually corrected his story. And now the modified cover after the little girl's comment actually shows a girl making all the toys. But this gives you an example of the invisible bias. Even the Royal Society displays this as a reason for disparity of gender disparity in science on their webpage. There's a wonderful film that has been made in the US called Picture a Scientist, which brings this out through interviews and conversations. It's available on Netflix. I advise everybody to see the film. Normally, if I have a longer talk, I give example from this film, but I would here just say that it brings out what is invisible and unconscious bias. Further, now I want to connect with my general topic that this invisible and unconscious bias is not only a property of gender inequity. I mean, I have to think myself how often we do not pay attention to the suggestions of a person because he or she is not fluent in English, because he or she is from a rural background, or in the Indian context, science in India, we sometimes do not pay enough attention to a person because the person is trained in India and not outside in the hallowed centers like MIT or Princeton or Oxford and Cambridge. So in our lives, we need to look at the content of the message that we hear in an exchange. It should not be colored by our biases about the message. So is that enough? Will that be the end of the story? Of course not. It is necessary, but far from sufficient. In fact, we need to advance on two different fronts. One is policies, making sure that the policies themselves are not affected by the invisible bias. And we need to bring about changes in social attitudes and conventions. Being aware of one's own invisible bias is just one of the changes. And this awareness is something that we need to bring about in the society for successful implementation of the policies themselves. And again, the kind of conferences in which I'm speaking are one of the vehicles through which one can bring about this awareness. In fact, I would like to end this discussion by telling you about something very nice about the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy of India, which was released now almost a year and a half ago, maybe a year and 3 months ago in January 2021. And it has its own chapter on equity and inclusion. So the discussion on equity and inclusion cuts across all the issues. Previously one had a small discussion on gender equity, another one for including those on the margins of the society, and so on and so forth. A holistic approach of equity and inclusion can take us much more further than, and perhaps even faster. In fact, the point about these considerations is to insist that equity and inclusion should be an overarching feature of all the policy discussions, and it should focus on equity, not necessarily equality. And the goal of equity and inclusion policy, in fact, is twofold. Again, I repeat this because I think this is important: to facilitate inclusion for the groups that are underrepresented, and to facilitate equity for those groups where inclusions exist to some extent. Now, the point is that successful implementation requires both institutional processes. It requires changes in the institutional mindset. It requires changes in the societal processes. And commitment from all kinds of different structure becomes necessary. And this can come only from creating awareness. Awareness that this is not beneficial only for the excluded groups, only for the women, or only for the traditional technologies, but also for science. And it makes pragmatic and economic sense. This thinking has to become part of the ecosystem. So in fact, one of the suggestions of the STEEP 2020 policy is that each educational institution, each government department should have its own equity and inclusion office. And this is not a watchdog office. This is more an office which tries to see holistically how one can bring about equity and inclusion in the system. So one has to introspect and autocorrect for our own invisible biases in our own professional and personal lives. We need to be inclusive, and the inclusion begins at home as to how you treat your spouse, how you treat your children, whether you ask your boy and a girl, any one of them, equally when a guest comes and you have to give them a glass of water. All of us, individuals, scientists, science administrators, all need to be inclusive in all we do. So the path to go to a situation where we will talk about scientists and engineers and not their gender or not their caste or not their language, surprisingly, goes to the path of being very, very aware of the same for a while. And all of us, individuals, society, and the governments need to work towards this. I hope someday to live in that heaven where I am looked upon as a scientist who happens to be a woman rather than a woman scientist. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Godbole, for the most enlightening talk. I feel so awed to hear you make so many poignant points about diversity, but also how this concept is so essential, not only to promote science, but all aspects of life. I loved hearing you say that equity and diversity should not be perceived as charity. And most of all, I loved hearing you present the profiles of some of the women and how they went unrecognized for decades and decades. So if you will, maybe please ask some questions to further our enlightenment on this topic. So thank you so much.
Sure, please go ahead. I would be more than happy to have a conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, you're an accomplished scientist in your field, but you've also done so much work to advance opportunities for women in science. Can you talk about some of the things like behind the scenes that you did to inspire and enable women from underrepresented groups to be in leadership positions as scientists, like at the doc and postdoc levels where you mentioned that that's where some of the barriers start appearing? So how did you inspire them not be worried and not let unconscious bias creep in?
let me try to tell you a little bit. This might be a slightly long answer, but I think it would cover many other issues that I have seen in the, sort of questions that you had shared, which you wanted to also me to comment upon. To begin with, let me tell you that what I have presented today is an understanding of the subject I have got after 20 years of working in this. And part of it has been actually things that I learned or absorbed during this process of interacting with other younger people. So, for example, one of the things that I did on behalf of, when I was the chair of the Indian Academy of Sciences, Women in Science Working Group, or what we call Panel for Women in Science, I used to actually hold and arrange these workshops, which I used to call Women in Science, Careers in Science. And these used to be, various discussions from time to time when we would have some very smart, very high achiever women scientists talk about their science. And then you would have a discussion about the issues of women in science. And in fact, I remember, and that I, for example, from time to time, I would, if a very special, very high profile woman scientist would come to India, would come to my institute, and I was lucky in that I worked in a very high profile institute myself. So some really high profile women scientists came to us. And whenever they would come, I would actually organize discussion sessions around these scientists about the issues of women in science. And I can tell you, actually, there are women young girls, postdocs, who told me after attending one of such sessions that, I was weighed down with the problems I had. But then, yes, indeed, I listened to this session, and that gave me the confidence that if these people can do it, if the seniors can do it, I can do it too. And in fact, actually, I think one of the things that we did, not just myself, but this was a group with which there was a task force that was formed. And as a result of the actions of this task force, what is called the Women in Science Task Force of the Department of Science and Technology, actually the government introduced certain requirements about having a good creche on campus for a good, for high profile research institutes at least. And I know certain young girls, so this was appreciating the fact that not just the young faculty, but the young postdocs, the senior students, if they have children, they would need the creche. Yes. And in fact, very recently, I met one lady who is now a big entrepreneur, and she was a postdoc in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research and told me how she benefited from the creche that was on campus during her postdoctoral days. So I guess there have been these kinds of small efforts, and I think that answers your question. There is a second aspect to this answer, and which is something about Leelavati's daughters, but I think I would come to that when you ask me question regarding that.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. So as you yourself mentioned in your talk that, times are changing not only in India, but worldwide, where many young girls and women are drawn to the STEM disciplines that traditionally used to be dominated by men, and to some extent, it's balancing a little more right now. But as an emerging scientist in your own field, when you started your career, I'd love to hear you talk about how you broke the glass ceiling, given both obvious and unconscious biases.
This is a bit of a difficult question to answer, because one cannot be objective about one's own journey. You appreciate what I mean by this, is that in a scientist's journey, there are obstacles always. And it's not clear which of them are setbacks. And it's not clear which setbacks, which obstacles come because you happen to be of a particular gender, or because you are just you. Because I can think of many deserving young men scientists also who don't necessarily make it to the end, because that is the problem of the processes of science also. So it becomes difficult, but I will still try to answer the question. So to begin with, let me tell you honestly that during the days when I was a STEM student, all the days when I was doing my master's, I did my PhD, and I can tell you that I was really, what is called an honor student, the top student. And actually, I don't think I ever felt the fact that I was doing something different because I was a woman. I believe, and that is why I emphasize this in my talk, I believe the first time I actually thought about that there might be a gender aspect. I take back that. And I should say that in my journey, there were problems, and I kept, there were problems that any scientist would have. And I believe that I sorted them out, frankly, with a lot of hard work and a lot of support from people who, emotional support sometimes, who believed in my dreams, who believed in my abilities. So I think it's very important to have a dream. And I think I had this dream. And I was doing this because this is what I wanted to achieve. So there were problems, there were difficulties, but I did not at that point stop back and think whether these are difficulties because I'm a woman or these are the difficulties because I'm just not good enough scientist. See, in your early stages in your life in science, you really don't know what you can achieve. See, that's what I really mean by a difference between being a scientist and being a doctor, engineer, or what have you.
Sure.
So in my early periods, I had, early life as a scientist, there were issues and I had to fight them and I had to overcome those issues. And I would say frankly that they got sorted out by a lot of hard work, a lot of, inner desire to continue, and a lot of support from people who believed and who saw the fire in my mind. So I think these support structures, and if they are not there, you have to create them. You have to realize that you need those support structures. They are essential. And whether you are wanting to break the glass ceiling or whether you want to just become, you're a man and want to become a good scientist, some of these support structures are essential. I was lucky that I got help. I could create those support structures in this period. And chance had it that I also did some very good work, because your good work speaks for you. And that normally in the long run helps also, because finally science is kind of objective and science does look at the importance of your research. I hope I have given you some answer to the question.
Yes, I mean, that was a beautiful answer. My goodness, I don't even know how to react. It was so beautiful. But I do want to follow up with you about your book, co-edited book on Leelavati's daughters. And, as I mentioned earlier, I was so impressed just listening to some of the profiles that you shared about in your talk. And I was just as fascinated to hear about these amazing women behind the scenes at NASA, because I'd watched a movie, Women Behind the Scenes, and I kept thinking, how is it that they never received recognition that they deserved? And so my question to you is, when you were connecting with all these amazing women to get stories and compile their stories for your books from other scientists like yourself, what was that experience like for you, given that you were already accomplished when you started working on, on the book? What was that experience like listening to?
Actually, very good question. Thanks for this. So let me take a step back and tell you that, as I said, till actually about 2001 or 2002, I must say that I hadn't thought too much about gender issues in science. So I hadn't stepped back or stopped to think whether the problems or some problems I had anything to do with gender or whether there is a gender inequity. I don't think I had time or I had inclination to think about it till then. But in 2001 or 2002, I was asked to give a talk in the International Union of Pure and Applied Physics meeting. This was the first international conference on women in physics, which was held by International Union of Pure and Applied Physics. And I was asked to talk about experiences of a woman physicist working in India. And I had worked in India by then for close to, 1980, so close to 25 years. So I had some amount of experience and I went there, I started talking, and there were about maybe 9 or 10 different women. And in fact, this IUPAP conference means that every country sends 4 representatives, and every country actually had a poster about the status of women in physics in their country. But there were plenary talks only by a few of us. And after I gave the talk of what does it feel like being a scientist and physicist in India, actually some women from Ghana, from Malaysia, I still remember, they came to me and they said, when you spoke, we could relate to you. And we felt that if she could do it, we can do it too. And it is at that time that I realized that I wanted to have stories. And this was the part of the answer to, this in part the answer to your first question. Why I went about doing and editing Lilavati's Daughters, because I wanted to create a resource book for young girls and boys of India to make them aware of women scientists. They were not Marie Curie, they were not Dorothy Hodgkins, not people like that. But they were professional scientists who contributed to science. And I loved collecting those stories, because I will tell you something that I found in all those stories is more or less what I gave you as an answer when you asked me the question. Because we had all of them, we had asked the same question: what helped you? What hindered you? Will you do the same thing all over again if you had to live the life? And almost all of them said, of course, they would do exactly the same thing. They would pursue science. They all had enormous passion, and they all, created, I would say, their own support structures. And
awesome.
Many of them, however, said that they were there also because of chance. If it were not for this, I wouldn't be here. And then I felt, that was the one thing that made me feel that I should do more work for women in science so that we can take chance out of this equation. So I think this is what I learned from all those wonderful women. And these were the women who had studied in India, modern India, that is India after independence, or who had studied outside and who worked in the modern India. So that was Lilavati's Daughters. And I really think that it was really a need of the time, because I don't know, because there is a show called Who Will Be a Millionaire. So in India, there is a version of the same show. And that show is hosted by Amitabh Bachchan. And last year, in fact, or a year before last, this book, Lilavati's Daughters, appeared for a 500 million question in Who Will Be a Millionaire. So that this was last but one question. And the person actually got the answer. So it really reached and touched the common people of India. And I think that is what, for me, was the success of Lilavati's Daughters. And I should also be a little bit proud here that I think this was among one of the first of this type of books where the women themselves talked about this. That is, the women scientists talked about their life, talked about the problems, talked about their science. And since then, there have been actually a few books like this, but I think ours was one of the first few. So
awesome.
That's all
I mean, this sounds like it would make a wonderful documentary, all these profiles of women. As you were talking, I was thinking you had mentioned that there are many policies in India that allow women to balance their professional and personal lives, both at the start as well as at the peak of their careers. So you also mentioned that policies are great, but they need to be converted into valued outcomes. So in your opinion, even people who want to increase awareness about the contributions of women, not just in science, but generally in all spheres of life, something about increasing, women's awareness. Actually, it's about the role that they play in science and beyond.
A wonderful question, I must say. I congratulate you on the question. And I think, to my mind, the one film that I mentioned, in fact, which was this Picture a Scientist. I really think that documentaries like that, okay, or there was a wonderful documentary made on the life of, I think, Mariam Mirzakhani, the first field medalist, woman field medalist. So I have a feeling that we have to, in my opinion, the awareness can be raised by flooding the media by the stories of real successes, not trumped up successes. And the dedication, the fire that drove these women, and how society's attitudes actually from time to time did push them down. And I have a lot of belief, I would say, in people's, at least the scientific community's objectivity, that faced with enough evidence that this is really taking things away from science, we might see a change in that attitude.
Wow. Thank you so much for answering that question, because I keep thinking about that. How do you create awareness in a way that people actually listen and absorb the message? If you don't mind, one last question. Last December, JKYog had conducted the most incredible Bhagavad Gita summit, where we had a couple of physicists who actually talked about how their research drew them towards spirituality. If you don't mind my asking you, do you consider yourself a spiritual person? And if yes, I'd love to hear about how you see the connection between science and spirituality.
I can understand the question where you are coming from. But I should say that, okay, let me say this. I grew up in my childhood, where, for example, I took part in Bhagavad Gita recitation competitions and learned how to recite Gita when I was young. So I certainly grew up in a household where people, at least my father, had a spiritual inkling and spiritual leanings. But I should say that for me, Bhagavad Gita remains a wonderful book, which I cherish reading, cherish understanding. I sometimes dabble in what you can call dhyan and so on, more to concentrate myself. But I do not consider myself a spiritual person. I believe
I was just curious.
that there is a power which I do not understand yet in the language of science. But whether I would want to think about this, the answer is no. Whether I want to investigate this as a scientific concept, the answer is no. I still think that my puzzles
and I'm
about
sorry,
my world of fundamental particles is something that I would like to answer and think.
Sure. And I lied when I said that was the last question. So if you will allow me one last question, truly.
Okay.
So if you could change anything about how you have lived your life as a scientist, and also as a person with so many different roles in your life, is there anything that you would do differently?
Very, very difficult question. But I think, I believe, I feel that this is a shortcoming in my life. I don't think I worked enough for the society. I would have liked to make more time to do something more for the society than what I could do. I did do a few things, but I see that as perhaps the shortcoming. And last but not the least, there is one regret that I do have, and that's about a decision I took. It's a very personal decision, but I'm telling you about it. Is that me and my husband, ex-husband now, decided not to have children till we both could be in the same place, because dual careers are actually a big problem, as you know, scientist women's face. And then we never had children because we dissolved the marriage somewhere along the way. And not having children was perhaps one of the regrets I had. But then I must say that my nephew, my nieces, and also my innumerable students gave me so much love and affection that regret is there, but not as strong as it could have been. Okay?
Wow, thank you so much. I don't know what to say. I mean, you're so modest that if you feel like you could have done more for society, all those of us who are not doing enough for the community at large, we should definitely think a lot more about your words. And thank you so much. I'm truly, truly honored to have this chance to connect with you, to speak with you, hear your voice. It's one thing to read your biography. It's another thing to make a personal connection. So thank you so much for honoring us and for your amazing talk for the International Women's Day. Thank you.